Hey guys, welcome back to Intelligent Faith 315. This is Pastor Jay, so good to be with you today. We're going to be continuing on with part 3 of our lesson, Has Science Eliminated the Need for God? Do encourage you to tune into the first two parts of this same lesson if you haven't checked those out. I'm just going to get right into it so we can continue on with where we left off last time. As you remember, this lesson we're going to cover 5 reasons why we're claiming that science has not eliminated the need for God. So we're claiming that science doesn't actually draw men farther away from God, but science rather draws men nearer to God. So reason number 1 is the scientific founding fathers, that the modern founders of the modern scientific enterprise were largely Christians, theists, and believers in God. Number 2, we'll cover the claim of scientism, that scientism is a self-defeating idea and claim. Number 3, simple irrelevance, that 95% of science really has nothing to do with the truth claims of Christianity. Number 4, strong support. There is, however, 5% of relevant science that strongly does support the Christian worldview and belief in a theistic personal God. So we'll look at that 5% strong support. And then lastly, single perspective. That science is simply a single perspective, a single way to obtain truth and knowledge about reality. It's a good perspective and a reliable perspective, but it's by no means the only perspective about reality. And so we'll examine other perspectives, other ways that we can obtain truth about the world around us. And of course that gets into our epistemology. What's our theory of knowledge? How can we attain reliable, dependable knowledge about reality? So we still find ourselves in the first point, the scientific founding fathers. And up to this point, we looked at Plato and Aristotle. Though they were the first philosophers, they also happened to be some of the very first scientists. And these men were undoubtedly believers in God and soundly defeated the atheism and the materialism of their day. We also looked at Leonardo da Vinci, one of the most prolific artists, inventors, and scientists of his day as well, and also a very strong theist and Christian, as evident in his journals and his quotes. Also, Nicholas Copernicus, the man who was responsible in the 15th, 16th century for discovering heliocentricity, a definite believer in the Christian worldview, follower of Christ. Also Galileo Galilei, though he experienced some opposition of the church from his day, this doesn't diminish the fact that he himself personally was a wonderful man of science who also contributed to heliocentricity and many astronomical discoveries, as well as the invention of the modern telescope. And he was a devout follower of Christ, believer in God, again, as is evident from his writings. So Galileo. Also Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton, the father of what is called Newtonian physics. He is deemed by some people to be the greatest scientist of all time, is undoubtedly a very dedicated theist, actually a Christian theist, a lover of Christ, a follower of Jesus. And so this man who is responsible for so many scientific discoveries. He's the inventor of calculus, the discoverer of the law of universal gravitation, the 3 laws of motion, the theory of light, theory of color. Just an amazing man, has contributed so much to our modern scientific understanding. But yet he wrote a commentary on the book of Revelation, on the book of Daniel, because he was such a devout believer and follower of Christ, of the Christian worldview. And again, all you have to do is just examine his writings and his life, and this is very, very obvious. Though it's rarely mentioned, Isaac Newton, one of the greatest scientific minds, also a great Christian of his day. Louis Pasteur, we left off here, the father of bacteriology. Some people call him the father of modern medicine. He soundly disproved in his day the theory of spontaneous generation, and he is a devout follower of Christ as well. So, Louis Pasteur was the man that coined the phrase, science brings men nearer to God. So, as opposed to many atheists or humanists or naturalists today, Louis Pasteur, he did thoroughly believe that natural science and the study of it brought men closer to God and nearer to God, not farther away. He saw science and the pursuit of belief in God as complementary, not as contradictory. So we're just going to continue on with some of the other founding fathers of the modern scientific enterprise. Francis Bacon, a man who may be well known to many of you, this man actually is credited as the inventor of what is called the scientific method. There really is no one singular scientific method, but what is commonly referred to as a scientific method was invented by, and this man is credited with it, Francis Bacon. He lived in 1561 to 1626. This Christian man was an English philosopher, a statesman, a jurist, an author, and a scientist. He is credited for developing what is today known as the scientific method of empirical investigation. Very handy tool for empirical studies. Francis Bacon is quoted as saying this: "Science is only an image of the truth." It's one representation, one facet of the truth. He said atheism is rather in the lip than in the heart of man. In other words, Francis Bacon would say that atheism is something that men say with their mouths but don't really believe in the depths of their being. He says small amounts of philosophy lead to atheism, but larger amounts of it lead us back to God. So he's talking here with the pursuit of truth, really speaking of natural philosophy or of science. Small amounts of philosophy lead to atheism, but large amounts of it, large amounts of philosophy, research of science, lead us back to God. And so again, Francis Bacon would be a man who would encourage you, as we undergo scientific study, to follow the evidence wherever it leads. And he says, one of the modern founders of the scientific enterprise, that it leads men back to God. So Francis Bacon, another man who would fall within the camp that science and belief in the Christian theistic God are complementary. Also, Johannes Kepler, a very interesting man if you're familiar with astronomy at all. Johannes Kepler lived in 1571 to 1630. In addition to being a Christian, he was a German mathematician and astronomer. He was a key figure in the 17th century scientific revolution, and he's best known for his laws of planetary motion, his work in the field of optics, and inventing an improved version of the refracting telescope. So a very intelligent man, one of the fathers of astronomy and planetary motion and mechanics. And Johannes Kepler says this. He says, quote, "The goal of all investigations of the external world should be to discover the rational order and the harmony which has been imposed on it by God, and which he revealed to us in the language of mathematics." So again, Dr. Craig has this argument for God's existence, which basically states that if mathematics has applicability to the natural world, then God exists. If God did not exist, then mathematics would have no actual applicability to reality, to the physical world. Why should we expect that calculations on a piece of paper should actually correspond to the physical natural world? But of course we know that they do. We know that mathematics has true applicability in the universe and in reality. And Johannes Kepler would seem to agree. He says that mathematics is kind of a revelation of the rational order and the harmony which has been imposed on the world by God, and it's revealed through the study, the language of mathematics. He says, geometry is unique and eternal. It is a reflection from the mind of God. Interesting that the idea of a perfect sphere or a perfect triangle or a perfect square, these are eternal, unchanging concepts. If you want to do some research on that, you can study the conceptual argument for God's existence. We have an episode of that on our Reason to Believe podcast. Also on our website, the conceptual argument for God's existence. And Johannes Kepler here would say that geometry is unique and eternal, and geometric ideas and shapes are a reflection of the mind of God. He says the diversity of the phenomena of nature is so great, and the treasure hidden in the heavens is so rich, precisely in order that the human mind shall never be lacking in fresh nourishment. And so Johannes Kepler has this hungry intellect, a hungry mind, to discover, through studying nature and the natural world, the rational order imposed on it through the mind of God is reflected in the language of mathematics. And I do believe it was Johannes Kepler that said that science is simply a method through which we discover the mind and thoughts of God. So Johannes Kepler, fascinating scientist, mathematician, inventor, and he obviously, through his quotes, is a devout believer and follower of God. He saw that science was complementary, not contradictory, to belief in God. So also Robert Boyle and his gas laws. Of course, you see here that he, in one of his books, speaks of dedicating it to the love of God. Very interesting. Robert Boyle lived from 1627 to 1691. He was a 17th century natural philosopher. Natural philosopher, of course, as I said, is science. It's one way to refer to the pursuit of science. He was a chemist, a physicist, and inventor, but also he was noted for his writings in Christian theology. And this is what you see a copy of right here. Boyle is regarded today as the first modern chemist and as one of the founders of modern chemistry. So one of his quotes, Robert Boyle says here, quote, "Neither the fundamental doctrine of Christianity nor that of the powers and effects of matter and motion seem to be more than an epicycle of the great and universal system of God's contrivances, and makes but a part of the more general theory of things, knowable by the light of nature, improved by the information of the Scriptures." He says, so that both these doctrines seem to be but members of the universal hypothesis, whose objects I conceive to be the natural counsels and works of God, so far as they are discoverable by us in this life. And so Robert Boyle here making reference to God, to the Scriptures, to the Christian worldview, the Christian Bible. And he says that basically, and this was very common in his day, as it's common today, that there's essentially two ways in which we can learn revelation about God. You have what people call the book of the Scriptures and the book of nature. You have what is called God's Word, and you have God's world. And so these two are complementary, they are contradictory. There are many things that we can learn about God from the created world, the natural order, His attributes, His existence, certain of God's actual qualities from the natural world, which are discoverable through science and chemistry, but then of course also through this special group of documents and writings handed down to us known as the Scriptures. But be that as it may, Robert Boyle, one of the greatest scientists to be alive in the 17th century, also famous for Boyle's gas laws. He was a devout believer in Jesus Christ and a believer in the theistic God and the Christian worldview. Another great founder of modern science. And finally, James Clerk Maxwell. James Clerk Maxwell, he lived from 1831 to 1879. If you know anything about the theory of electromagnetism, James Clerk Maxwell and Michael Faraday, both devout, serious Christian men, they discovered one of these fundamental forces of reality, electromagnetism, in their day. James Clerk Maxwell was a Scottish physicist and mathematician. His most prominent achievements was formulating classical electromagnetic theory. As I said, we'll see this was done in cooperation with Michael Faraday. His classical electromagnetic theory, his theory united all previous observations, experiments, and equations of electricity, magnetism, and optics into one consistent theory. This is called unification. It's something that's sought after by physicists, even to the degree to where today they're trying to find a theory of everything, TOE, to proceed with unification in many areas. And James Clerk Maxwell and Michael Faraday were able to do this in their day with electricity, magnetism, and optics. His achievement has been called the greatest achievement in physics since Isaac Newton's discoveries. So James Clerk Maxwell, undoubtedly a wonderful scientist, contributing vastly to the scientific enterprise. What does he say? He says, quote, "I believe that man's chief end is to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. This is taken straight from the Westminster Catechism, the Westminster Statement of Faith." James Clerk Maxwell, he echoes this when he says that man's chief end, the chief goal of man, is to glorify God and to enjoy Him forever. Almighty God, who has created man in your own image and made him a living soul. Why? That He might seek after you and have dominion over your creatures. Maxwell says a prayer. He says, "Teach us to study the works of your hands, that we may subdue the earth to our use and strengthen our reason for your service." So he's basically just saying that he does believe that God has given the earth and its resources to man to enjoy, to responsibly take care of it, to shepherd it, to steward it. And he says, teach us to study the works of your hands. And so again, James Clerk Maxwell is another one of the great founding fathers of the modern scientific enterprise who believed that through a studying of the natural created order, through the works of God's hands, we can more accurately see God's attributes, God's qualities, and we can discover the thoughts and the mind of God through a study of His works. So, interesting man. And as I said, Michael Faraday, a man who was his scientific companion in many senses of the word, Michael Faraday here in his older years and in his younger years, he lived from 1791 to 1867. He was a scientist, a chemist, a physicist, and philosopher who greatly contributed to the fields of electromagnetism and electrochemistry. Michael Faraday, as you can see here, was really the inventor of the battery, and then this was hooked up to weights using magnets, and it was actually the beginnings of kind of the electric motor. So very interesting discoveries this man made. And interesting, he didn't have even formal scientific education, but he was naturally passionate in pursuit of science. He's what you would call an automath or an autodidactic person, self-taught, and he became one of the greatest scientists of his day. Although he received little formal education, he was one of the most influential scientists in history. Albert Einstein kept a picture of Michael Faraday on his study wall alongside a picture of Isaac Newton. Interesting that Michael Faraday and Isaac Newton, two Christian scientists, were kept on the mantle of Albert Einstein, kind of dedicating, obviously, or displaying his affection for their scientific contributions. But interesting that Faraday and Newton were devout, dedicated Christian men, and even Albert Einstein, as we'll find out, believed in God's existence. And Michael Faraday is quoted as saying this: well, biographers have noted that, quote, a strong sense of the unity of God and nature pervaded Faraday's life and work. So biographers of Michael Faraday have said that a unity of God and the study of nature pervaded his work. Again, Michael Faraday was a man who believed that through opening the windows of science and looking into the mechanics of the natural world was a great way to discover the thoughts of God, the mind of God, and how he has constructed reality. We'll stop there for today. We'll continue on. I encourage you to come back and join us again as we seek to answer this question: has science eliminated the need for God? See you next time.